Extremely disoriented.
So I don't.
Okay, hello everyone. We're just going to take a few minutes for other people to get here. We'll start the program in about 2 minutes. We're just waiting for everybody to log on. I understand that people will be coming from all over the world. David Curzon has friends everywhere, so this is going to be quite an international show. Okay, I think we're ready to start. So I guess that will be me. Good evening. I'm Bonnie Fetterman, and I'm proud to be David Curzon's agent and editor for his new book, What Remains: Selected Poems, published by the Ben Yehuda Press. Welcome to our virtual publication party. We would have loved to have this event in person, but we're grateful to be able to celebrate with you on Zoom. I'd like to thank Congregation Anshe Hesed and Minyan Ma'at for hosting this Zoom event. Special thanks are due to Daron Ruskay and to Mike Thurlow, our Zoom maven, who guided us every step of the way. Thanks also to Fred Bogan for his technical assistance. In his long publishing career, David Curzon has been an author and editor of 7 books, including the well-known anthology, Modern Poems on the Bible. What Remains is a collection of his own poems on a broad range of themes, reflecting his many interests and passions. Rabbi Jack Reamer describes it best in the first published review of What Remains. He writes, "There are 90 poems in this collection. Most of them come out of the author's experience as he has wandered over the face of the earth. Some are recollections of precious moments in his life. Some are on what he learned by standing before great works of art. Some of them are conversations with those people in his life who meant the most to him. And almost everyone is a gem." Thank you, Jack. We agree. David has been a member of Minyan Ma'at for many years. Several of his friends from the Minyan will be reading poems from the book this evening, and I have the pleasure of introducing them. Our first reader, Stuart Klawans, is a longtime film and book critic whose reviews have appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, the Times Literary Supplement, Parnassus Poetry and Review, and too many other publications for me to mention. Stuart will be reading a few of David's autobiographical poems about growing up in Australia. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you. The first thing I want to say is thank you. I've admired David Curzon for a long time. It's a privilege to be invited to participate in this event. As Bonnie says, I've been asked to read a couple of autobiographical poems, poems of childhood and youth. If you've got your copy, you can read along. If you don't have your copy, I'm going to take the liberty of saying a few words about each poem before I read it, and I promise I'll be brief. Though I'll speak longer about the first poem because it's the short one. That's the fate of short poems. It's called An Australian Childhood. The first thing I notice about this poem is that there are no people in it except for the speaker. It's just the speaker and wild creatures, which the speaker seems to be able to name. So this must be some kind of Eden, is all I can conclude from that. It's an Eden in which there is a sting, but as you'll hear, it's a sting that can easily be assuaged. The form of the poem is simple and I would say gentle. It's composed in 4-line stanzas. The lines are short. The stanzas, except for the first, all begin with the word "and." This, to me, gives this something of the feeling of a child's experience of events. Kids experience events with very little sense of hierarchy or causation or even sequence. It's just one thing after another. So there's a kind of timelessness to the poem, and the timelessness is reinforced by the fact that the last stanza is almost identical to the first stanza. Of course, it's not really timeless because this is a reminiscence. The poem is written in the past tense. And I'm not sure of this. I won't bet on it, but I think there may be a discordant note in the poem. There's a role in the poem for the cry of a bird called the kookaburra. It's the Laughing Kookaburra. I've never been in Australia, but I've heard the call of the Laughing Kookaburra, and you have too, because this is a sound that is mixed into the soundtracks of all movies that have a jungle setting. So you've heard it too. You may have thought it was a monkey or an ape. It's not, it's a bird. All right, an Australian childhood. When I woke, I was greeted by the laughter of the kookaburras, and white cockatoos and red galahs flew in their dozens among the gum trees. And the fresh leaves I picked and crushed perfumed my fingers with eucalyptus. And up above, shy and hidden, nibbling the leaf tips, koalas were feeding, and the stinging of a bull ant's bite was eased by the sap of snapped bracken. And when I woke, I was greeted by the laughter of the kookaburras. This next poem, The Gardens, is longer and more complicated. It's or complex. It's composed in an epigraph and 2 fairly long and irregular stanzas. As you'll hear, it begins also in a kind of idyll in the natural world, but it's a natural world that's managed by people, sometimes trashed by people. And at a certain point, history intrudes into this natural landscape, history in 2 scales. So, The Gardens. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. Melbourne's Botanical Gardens, where I came to walk along the bordered paths with him and pose in short pants for the photos placed into this album I'm now leafing through, and eat my sandwiches beside the lake and cast bread on the waters for the swans. And later, when we met on Sundays, we went off to European movies, then to his small room where we played chess. He cut his dense black bread held close up to his chest. One afternoon, we passed a synagogue and saw some litter scattered on its steps, including lobster shells. He said, "This is deliberate desecration. They must know lobster isn't kosher." Daddy, it's not that. It's an Australian picnic, not cleaned up. I thought it was absurd. He didn't understand. This must have been around 1955. A mere 10 years had passed, and in 4 years, he'd suicide. And I would read the documents he kept inside their envelopes in a wood box. certificates of immigration, change of name, degrees, but mainly photographs and letters from his parents and his friends. And then I found a letter he had sent to Poland, the final one. It said, "I wish I could protect you from the sadists," and was stamped, "unable to deliver." Somehow I was not aware. He never talked of it. And now I try to visualize what happened to his parents and those smiling friends of his, and try to understand how it would feel, orphaned, divorced, recalling, to walk in the gardens of Babylon and not weep.
Wow. Thank you, Stuart, for that powerful reading. I was moved by this poem and moved by your reading of it all over again. Sharon Dolan is an award-winning poet and a 2021 NEA recipient. She is the author of 6 books of poetry, most recently a volume called Manual for Living, and a memoir entitled Hitchcock Blonde. Sharon is an associate editor at the Barrow Street Press and teaches poetry workshops in New York City and Barcelona, Spain. Sharon, we are delighted you could join us this evening.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And I want to just give a big mazel tov to David Curzon. It's a beautiful book, and here it is, and very excited to read from it. I'm reading 3 short poems, and the first poem contains the title of the book, What Remains. And what I really like about it, it's called A Marriage, is I like its simplicity and its understatement and its emotional restraint, which really allows, I think, the reader's emotions to come forward. So this is called A Marriage. There must have been some moments. What remains? The honeymoon. I awoke in that spacious room while she was sleeping, eased out of the bed and opened up one blind, and in the dawn I watched the renewals of her breathing form. Returning, I'd cleared customs. There she was, the only person in the crowd beyond the barrier. Then she caught sight of me, and all her waiting body waved her wave. The separation. We'd been out at night, had come back home in silence, just got in when she, while taking off her coat, had turned and told me simply, I've decided. Yes, that moment too is part of what remains. The next poem I'm going to read is an ekphrastic poem. I might even call it a meta-ekphrastic poem. By that I mean ekphrastic poems are poems about works of art. And I think this poem is in some ways thinking about what it is to write about works of art, as well as being an ekphrastic poem itself. And it's called An Old Master. Who needs vast canvases with battle scenes, or even small ones with 100 souls in hell or heaven or waiting in between? A head and shoulder portrait is enough. It shows me everything I want to see. The face up close, a stubble-chinned old man whose wrinkled grin insists on some response. That's what I thought when I was 21. Now in museums, I often find myself lingering in front of scenes of innocence being speared. I'm also curious about those crowds in hell. They're so diverse. And yet I still come back to that old man, and still, of course, don't know quite what to say. I should have mentioned that it's in these mirroring, it's a sonnet, it's in these stanzas that mirror each other. So it's 7 lines and 7 lines. And the final poem I'm going to read is a poem that's addressed to the reader. And what I like about it is that there's, as with all divination, there's always a sense of certainty as well as mystery. And this poem, I think, really captures that experience very well. It's called A Cold Palm Reading. Palm as in this palm. A cold palm reading. I have you in my mind, unknown reader, and now will venture a tentative cold reading. I'll start with facts you comprehend are true, but do not quite acknowledge in yourself. You are considerate, but there have been times of surprise at how self-centered you've become. You are unnecessarily defensive. Lower defenses would rarely have caused harm. You've been meticulous with trivia, and yet were careless with an important task. Thoughts of plans formed in youthful confidence disturb you more than you have cared to think. Both of us know all your capacities have not been adequately used. Some still could be. You give to reason more scope than you should. Your intuition often has proved right. Most people, even those you love, don't always understand what means the most to you. I sense you nearing a profound transition, but it is dark. I can't discern the other side. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. David Roskies, or David as many of us know him, is a literary scholar, historian, and author of many books on Eastern European Jewish culture. David was a founding member of Minyan Me'at, along with the late Alan Mintz, with whom he also co-founded Proof Text, a journal devoted to Jewish literary history. David is professor of Yiddish literature and culture at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He also taught at the Hebrew University, Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and the Russian State University of the Humanities in Moscow. David will read a few of the author's midrashic poems on the Bible and the Jewish historical experience. Shalom Aleichem, David.
Thank you so much for including me. So I'll be reading 3 short poems. The first is what I would call a counter commentary or a sacred parody for the way it parses Psalm 1 in light of the Jewish historical experience. David belongs to the 4th generation of modern Jewish poets, beginning with Chaim Nachman Bialik, who use scripture and the liturgy to signal a fundamental break with the God of the covenant, even as they hold fast to the broken covenant itself. So this first poem I shall read in 2 voices. One is an ecclesiastical voice, and the other in the down-to-earth voice of the poet. Psalm 1. Blessed is the man, not born in Lodz in the wrong decade, who walks not in tree-lined shade like my father's father in this photo, nor stands in the way of sinners waiting for his yellow star, nor sits, if he could sit, in their cattle car. But his delight is being born as I was in Australia, far away. And on God's law he meditates night and day. He is like a tree that's granted the land where it is planted, that yields its fruit by reason of sun and rain in season. The wicked are not so. They burn their uniforms and go their way. Therefore, the wicked are like Cain, who offered fruit which God chose to disdain. And the way of the righteous is Abel's, whose sacrifice God chose to choose, and who was murdered anyway. To King David, Psalm 1. I know, my namesake, you didn't write all the Psalms, and certainly not those howls from out of Babylon, the first exile, where remnants of your nation stunned, adjusted after the first destruction. And yet these praises, the collection's name, and petitions, arguments, and more straightforward cries are rightly, so I feel, ascribed to you, since it turns out you were, your reign and Solomon's, our people's brief glory. Yet, I and other poets don't envy you for that, not even for the life which wrung composition out of you, but for the settings in temples, synagogues, monasteries, cathedrals, hospices, in which your praises have been chanted, sung, recited, read, whispered, remembered in the night before a battle, near sickbeds, in prisons, slave plantations, gulags, the death camps, and for the harps, pipes, cymbals, strings, named in the short last psalm that someone wrote, some lucky poet who might have heard it as priests walked up the temple steps to where they'd splash the sacrificial blood, and still 3,000 years beyond those Bronze Age rites, it still is chanted by the descendants who now live in Melbourne, Buenos Aires, New York, Tel Aviv, who also sing a simple line of yours which says, "How glorious is your name in all the earth." The chosen people. The Hebrews in Egypt who chose not to leave, mostly those holding appointed positions, refused to be part of a stampeded populace led by a mad, stuttering murderer who discoursed in the desert with burning bushes. These realistic skeptics expected the worst. They could predict worship of golden calves. It made sense to them to stay civilized slaves and not be witness to the separating sea, the pillar of cloud as guide by day, the pillar of fire as guide by night, the struck rock that gushed water, the thunder and lightning as signs over Sinai, the glow of Moses descending the mountain. So a happy belated birthday to you, David. Bis 120.
Thank you very much, David. Well, now let us meet the author, David Curzon, in conversation with the prize-winning journalist, our friend Sandee Brawarsky. This interview was taped last week in David's apartment.
Good evening. I'm Sandee Brawarsky. I'm so happy to be here with my friend, the extraordinary poet, David Curzon, and thanks to all of you for joining us. David and I have known each other for many years through Anshe Chesed and through a shared friend in Israel. We've had many conversations over the years, but this is the first time we're doing so on Zoom. As you have already heard, David grew up in Australia, but I'm not sure that everyone knows that David holds a degree in physics and a doctorate in economics and had a distinguished career working for NASA in Washington and then for the United Nations as chief of the Central Evaluation Unit, assessing peacekeeping operations and refugee and environmental programs, all the while writing poetry, editing volumes of poetry, translating poetry, traveling, and collecting amazing art. His new collection of 90 poems, What Remains, some of which our outstanding readers just shared, includes some poems that are autobiographical. Some are meditations, descriptions, appreciations of lost friends and family. Some are earthy, sensuous, full of passions and contradictions, sometimes humor and a kind of playfulness, history too. All are sharply observed, full of wisdom and truth. David is joining us from his home on the Upper West Side, where you can see some of his art collection and many, many books behind him. So in celebration of the new book, we're going to have a conversation about his life and his literary work. So, hi, David. Nice to see you here. So let's start with Australia. Can you tell us how your parents made their way to Australia? I know each has a different story, so perhaps start with your mother's family.
My mother's family got to Australia in the 1920s. So she was born in Australia. My father emigrated from Poland to Australia in the late 30s and tried to get his family to come with him, but they wouldn't, and unfortunately they all died in the Holocaust.
It seems that poetry has always been a part of your life. Can you talk about some of the earliest influences?
Well, first of all, my mother recited poetry. So when we were doing the dishes before we had a dishwasher, she would, wash the dish, and then she'd hand it to me and recite something. And then she'd hand it to me and I'd continue the recitation and she'd pick up another one and so on. So that was the earliest way that I learned poetry. But poetry was also part of the school, part of, we learned and we read poetry at school.
Have those earliest poems that your mother shared stayed with you?
I thought they did, but now I can't think of any. Yes, they have actually.
Maybe we'll start with a poem about your mother. Would be great to hear. If you would read the poem called Yortzeit. Let's turn to page 23. You'll find it. I love this poem.
Section 1. This is, of course, after she died. I'd fixed a time to view the body and entered the room empty except for the central coffin, the top resting against the trestle. A white cloth was pulled back from your unearthed face. Your cheeks shone, your mouth was open, your teeth protruded, like the head I'd gazed at in a book you gave me for my bar mitzvah, Gods, Graves and Scholars, which described the findings of those who uncovered where we had come from, the face of a mummy after its finding had been undone. 2. I keep alive you at my bedside reciting Byron, and your accent on each beat, and your pause before the rhyme word to let me follow fold with gold. And our delight in verse concerning the two brains of long brontosaurus, one in front and one at the back, to catch thoughts the head had missed. And an early evening while you was cooking, and I brought crayons to the kitchen table and made up creatures my mind imagined when you had read me, what varied being peoples every star. And your soft comment while tossing salad, not disapproving, perhaps surprised at the fact of difference. I'd always thought Pope meant they're gone. And you transcribing on a cardboard bookmark the stray stanza that took my fancy, which you found at last in Swinburne's collected 1,100 pages. After 30 years, when I emptied your bedroom's bookcase, I came on that marker. I saw the ink had absorbed in the cardboard. Your clear writing had bled and blotted. 3. The books you borrowed from the local library were in the kitchen. When I returned them, the head librarian fought back her tears to say, your mother was a scholarly lady. 4. I now keep a photograph of you on the table opposite my apartment entrance and pass it as I enter and as I leave. And at each glance, I get a small stab, the physical effect as it registers. 5. I have a favorite jacket which I'd frayed around the cuff. The tailor in New York suggested that I throw the thing away, adding, this garment isn't dying, it is dead. And so it would have been, but I took it back home to you, the visit which was the last, and watched you straighten out the broken threads and line them up, and then bend your mending with stitches of a fine matched cotton, so that now I have to search with some of the same care you gave to it, to see your hand in fabric you had touched.
Thank you, David. It's really beautiful, really beautiful. I'm tempted now to there's also a beautiful poem about your father. Maybe we should maybe grab some water, and if you would read The Grave on page 4.
The Grave. Again, it's in sections. Section 1. There was the grave, a gravel top, no slab, and at his head, in Hebrew and English scripts, brother of Tola, who also killed herself, father of David, who doesn't quite know now why he is here, except to photograph the setting and the stone and pull a weed in what seems otherwise a well-kept plot and stir the gravel with his fingertips. The trees have thickened in these 20 years, and even in unyielding cloudless heat, the avenue they form is all in shade, inviting the eye to something it forgot, a little lodge where the brief service was, now empty, locked. I rattled at the door. 2. And then I left and flew through Athens. I had a single afternoon to see again the statues from the Cyclades, the Mask of Gold, the classic marbles, the rock crystal bowl, and to be shocked by gravestone fragments I must have glanced at 20 years ago. Each stele portrays a person gone and those remaining, and the farewell gestures they wish to record in sculpture's deep relief. Some showed eyes meeting, other eyes looked down, and in one stele the dead man stretched his hand toward the living, whom he almost reached. How civilized to visit if the grave contained this reaching outward back to life. 3. Mosaic law, of course, forbids such art, which risks idolatry. In any case, there was no reaching out. No note was found beside your tiny bottle's missing pills. I davened Kaddish at your open grave, a mourner's prayer that doesn't mention death or offer gestures, but in praise refers to the world created as it had been willed. And so I'm left with memories. One time you let me in your darkroom to take part in your enlargements and developing. I still recall the shudder when I saw, drowned in solution in that shallow tray, blank paper slowly come to show a face.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So your father was a physician, is that correct?
That's correct, yes. Mm-hmm.
What kind of medicine did he practice?
General practice.
And was it your mother's family instrumental in getting him to Australia?
Yes, they were. They in the 1930s, when it was clear what was happening in Europe, my grandfather, who was a successful businessman, went to Poland and offered to pay the travel expenses of Jewish colleagues who wanted to leave and emigrate to Australia. I believe my father was the only one. The others said, how can we think of going to Australia, around on the other side, the other hemisphere, around the other side of the world, and speaking a language other than Polish, and so on. So he came. That was it.
What was the Jewish community like when you were growing up in Melbourne?
It was very tight because it was formed by people who had basically wanted to get away to the other side of the world from Europe, and they were very close together.
Mm-hmm. So before we move on, let's just read one more Australia poem. These are really beautiful. Look at page 11, the poem called Home.
Okay, Home, and the subtitle is Australia. The center of the land in which I came to life is unremitting red desert, stretching its monotonous prospects to thin horizons, an aridity as immense as most other countries. But when rains come, they come in torrents, creating rivers which pour into vast depressions, lapsed lakes that wait for replenishment, which returns to them their name and purpose. And then the desert displays what was dormant within it, the grass seed preserved throughout parched seasons, and yields a springtime that even has flowers, and heat until heat evaporates the reaches of water. And once more rivers and lakes dry out to depression, and loam desiccates to hard clay, and winds traverse that unperturbed surface, the heart of the land in which I came to life.
Thank you. Thanks. I understand though that you left Australia and did a lot of traveling. I wonder what drew you to places like India and China, perhaps, rather than going to Europe?
Well, Europe for me was the continent of the death camps and the Holocaust. So I had no desire to go to Europe. And India was completely strange, you know, something utterly different. And I was attracted to that. Mm-hmm. Traveled around and later went to China.
Mm-hmm. And did you start collecting art in those early travels?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately not enough, because in those early travels, Indian art was still very, very inexpensive. The Indians mostly couldn't afford it, and it wasn't that the Europeans weren't that interested in it. So I got some very good things.
Mm-hmm. Is there a connection that you see between your love of art and your love of poetry?
As you said, I studied physics as an undergraduate and then economics, and so art and poetry were very different, a different aspect of life.
Mm-hmm. What are the pieces just to your right? Where are they from?
3 of them are small Netsky, small Japanese pieces of art. And then a couple of others are Chinese ceramics. And then here, for example, they're small scholar rocks. The Chinese collected rocks as abstract art, and they make wonderful abstract art. So I have collections of those. Then here is something from the Middle East, a small Egyptian piece from about 3000 BC, BCE, excuse me. And then there are Indian pieces of Indian.
So there's a beautiful poem about some of your collections called Correspondences, and that's on page 49.
Correspondences. Where have I found my correspondences? In a spare landscape by Nitzan, which shows an empty pavilion on a riverbank, shaded by half a dozen slender trees, 6 gentlemen, the Chinese scholars call them, all sketched with a dry brush, and beyond the other bank are his low mountains and the vacant sky. And in wet brushstrokes by the eccentric monk Bada Shanren, the old man of the hills, who painted crazed black minor birds and fish with eyes which seemed to glare an angry accusation at those blank stretches of paper they are floating in. And in the famous landscape by Fan Kuan, a distant cliff face towering over scrubby trees, and the tiny cortege with a waterfall pouring down the cliff in an unbroken plunge, far above the little wanderers who head away from it to the scroll's edge. And in meticulous small painted fans by Ma Yuan, whose solitary scholars live in one exquisite moment when the moon shines through the branches of a fruit tree just in bud, or sit in contemplation while below the torrent far beneath them rushes on.
The book title, What Remains, appears in your poem, A Marriage, which we heard earlier. And the first line reads, "There must have been some moments, what remains." I wonder if you can say more about what that phrase, "what remains," means to you and why it seemed right for this collection.
What remains in general is the category of the poems that I wanted to keep or to highlight. They're selected poems, and since I published a couple of other books before, most of those are not included. So these are a selection of later poems for the most part.
I wonder what the process of writing is like for you. Do you write in one sitting? Do you take notes? Your language is like so precise. I mean, sometimes it's spare, but the lines have a real rhythm to them. I wonder, do you read out loud while you're reading? While you're writing?
While I'm writing, no. Someone that loves poetry hears the rhythms of poetry anyhow. But for example, some of the poems indicate how I got to them. One is entitled "The News," and the first line is, "When I switched on the TV news last night, it showed," and so on and so forth. So I got that as a sonnet.
Do you do a lot of editing of your poems once you write them?
Yes, and also a lot of throwing out.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, I can't imagine anyone writing poems that doesn't do a great deal of editing. So this is the result of a lot more words and lines and so on that got kicked out. Another way of writing a poem is the one in the next page, on page 15. It's entitled "Confession of Faith," and there are 4 stanzas, and each begins, "Yes, I believe," and then, since I'm not that much of a believer, I counted. "Since I believe we are no longer residing in paradise," is the first stanza.
Another sort of area that I wanted to talk about with you is your writing contemporary midrashim. Now you've told us you're not a believer. I wonder how you fit together your interest in Jewish sources and Jewish texts and a kind of traditional method that you're using with the fact that you're not particularly observant, as you said.
Well,
I guess maybe you can
observer-
start, maybe explain to us what a midrash is.
Oh, a midrash is a response to a biblical text, usually an imaginative response. So that there are collections of midrashim from the rabbinic tradition, and I discovered that this was a form of writing that appealed to me, in which I was able to do. So, for example, I suppose it's my anthology poem called "The Ant," which has been in lots of collections. And so the text is Proverbs 6:6, which reads, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider its ways." And then, so I start, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard," and then I put in my own responses. "Watch it lug an object forward, single file," and so forth. And then, having described its efforts, I end up, "Consider her ways and be content."
Mhm. So how did you learn about midrash, and how did you first become interested?
I did not go to synagogue and so on for a long time, for decades. And, I went off to India or China and so on. And then I decided I wanted to come back. And then I went to a shul on my street, and I left after about 5 minutes. I found it boring and so on. And so I asked someone, what's a good congregation to go to? And they said, well, there's lots of good conservative congregations, but there's one you should never go anywhere near. It's filled with extremely arrogant intellectuals. And I said to myself, that sounds perfect. It's perfect. So that's the one I went to. And I'm happy there and stayed there.
Mhm. And so some of the people there actually guided you in your study of midrash?
They had to, because I didn't know anything. And I had taken myself, against the advice, to a congregation in which almost everybody was a professor of some rabbinic some rabbinic specialty. In other words, I was a complete ignoramus. And so for a while, I sat at the back and didn't say anything. And then I eventually tiptoed up closer to the front. And then someone suggested that I give a drush, a commentary. And I put a tremendous amount of work into it and checked it out with everybody. And they liked it, because it turns out that I had, through the poetry, I suppose, I had the capacity to play around with the texts. Also because I wasn't that religious.
Mhm.
And I played around in a way that I discovered the ancient rabbinic texts had reflected. They'd start off with a text, and then they'd give half a dozen different interpretations, some of which were completely contrary to the others, and that appealed to me a lot. So I copied that.
Mhm. And did this kind of involvement bring you closer to tradition?
Oh yes, because that is the tradition. And also, since I was eventually going to get up and give a commentary to a group of professors, all of whom were world famous, or not all, but many of whom were world famous commentators, I had to be fairly careful about checking what I was saying with people who knew the tradition. And then I discovered that the tradition was a wonderful thing anyhow, that it had, that it permitted and encouraged a very large range of commentaries. none of which necessarily pious.
What's it like for you to read these poems out loud? These are poems that you've written, some years ago.
I enjoy it.
You read so well. It's really beautiful.
Thank you. No, I like them. I'm fond of them, I must say.
So a number of the poems also touch on the Shoah and your family's history.
Yes. Mhm.
Maybe you can read us Benedictions on page 88.
Benedictions. On 29 October 1941, in Kovno, 30,000 ghetto Jews were rounded up for a selection by the Germans. Rav Elia, who had fled from Poland, was in the crowd of those unfortunates and came to Rabbi Oshri to inquire the proper form of benediction to be recited as the murdering began. He wanted to pass among the throng in the Demokratia Platz and teach it to the others. Surely those who found themselves concerned with the form of blessing to say while they were being murdered were living hallowed lives. And as for us, the abundance of the world will have to do. I'm a little surprised that I start almost crying at some of these.
Well, your poems are very emotional for the reader too. They're filled with emotion.
Yes, apparently.
Yeah. Dave, you're such a natural teacher. Have you taught poetry, taught writing, or taught economics, perhaps?
I tried both of them, and I decided that I wanted to write poetry. I also enjoy eating well and living well, so I didn't particularly want to be an impoverished poet. So I happened to have a PhD in economics. I applied to the UN. I'd given some lectures at the UN, some talks, and they had a post vacant. And so I went there and had a very nice salary. I was hired by a Frenchman who liked poetry and was happy that I wrote it. So I had a 9-to-5 job that paid well, and then I had the evenings and weekends off to write.
There's one poem about your work life called An Office at Night. If you would read, that's on page 17.
An Office at Night, and the subtitle is circa 1980. It's late. The day's waste has been taken. The solitary cleaner has vacuumed all corridors. The leather reception couches, the long conference table, the boardroom's world maps are now merely a furniture of unlit areas. And the enclave of confidential documents is locked, the way barred by metal gates. I have a key to its secrets, but don't need them. My desk is littered with memoranda, transcripts of meetings. I draft with selected instruments, dark leads, masking tapes, erasers that leave no trace. Half my effort is over. The outline is clear. I pause, re-examine discarded passages, pick up sharp barber's scissors, shear between disparate thoughts, and collate them in other contexts. And now I glance at the wall opposite, at the African masks I have chosen to confront me. A monkey's visage reduced to one huge grin, a disc consisting of eyes, mouth, and horns, vision, ingestion, and defense, rudimentary essentials. And on a small table is a Borlée statue, a man standing with thick legs spread apart, arms bent, hands clasped in front, grasping both sides of an extended beard, a reflexive position, self-contained, stable, an ancestor figure with austere features, abstracted as any animal, his pose dominating the silence of this late night with simple presence, with character issuing from stance alone. The office was in the United Nations. I wrote it when I was working.
Thank you, David. So I thought we'd conclude back in New York City. And I wonder if after all these years, New York feels like home to you.
Oh, yes, yes, it certainly does. I mean, it felt like home almost as soon as I arrived because amongst all the other people that are in New York is a very large number of Jews, and they congregate, and I'm living on the Upper West Side, so I'm in a Jewish city. People downtown are in a Chinese city and so on, but it certainly felt at home.
I thought we'd read one last poem, which actually is the first poem in the collection, and that's called A View of Manhattan on page 1.
A view of Manhattan. As I looked out a dusk window, there was slight traffic in channeled patterns between the fixed and silent vigil of other buildings, and I became, by the illusion of mere reflection, imposed upon them. But evening darkens, their lights appeared. They slowly formed galaxies of yellows that stared at me, confronting presumption with inviolate silence, like the worship stars above Babylon, in the beginnings that led to this.
Wow. Thank you, David. And thank you so much for reading and speaking. I want to recommend the book to everyone. You can find a link to how to order it in the chat. But really, David, this has been wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And we'll see you again soon. I look forward to having this conversation in person before too long.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks, David. Thanks, Sandee, for that wonderful conversation and for giving us a window into David's life and work. David, we wish you the best with this publication. We hope it brings you much joy. I'd like to thank all your friends who read so beautifully tonight. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. We hope you enjoyed the program. If you'd like to order the book at the book launch discount, as Sandee mentioned, there's a link to the publisher's website in the chat box and also at the bottom of your invitation. Have a good evening and sei gesund. Be well.